By the end of today's session, hopefully you'll have a working understanding of how AI is changing the hiring landscape, particularly in technology. And then we'll learn some techniques to battle harden people-centric processes, such as talent acquisition using AI. Now, just understand, I chose talent acquisition because of this personal mission that I was on, but it could also be useful for other human-centered processes as well. All right, so today's agenda is going to look a little bit like this. First, I'm going to start with some anchoring bias. I'm going to talk about the circumstances that kind of led me to take on this experiment. And then we're going to talk about my personal mission a little bit here, because if you're going to risk it all, you might as well make it personal. We'll talk about the process that was followed. Now, because of the magnitude of research that was required for this exercise, we're only going to cover a couple data points associated with this experiment. And then finally, we'll talk about the outcomes. All right, so first of all, I need to anchor you guys in some bias. You guys need some context, because this wasn't just initiated out of nowhere, right? There was a reason why I started this process. So we're going to start with a little bit about me, and I know it's a little cliche, but it's important to understand my context and the things that I want to solve for and how it relates to this exercise. So my name is Daniel Pries. I'm an engineering manager of digital experience teams for a super regional bank. Now, I'm an engineer first with 20 plus years of experience across various industries, ranging from bare metal computer chips to cloud native architecture and everything in between. I'm currently on a personal mission to improve the developer experience for the teams that I oversee. And I love growing others. I like to watch the light bulb turn on as people learn new skills and help people through their soft skills and as they navigate their career journey. So when I started this experiment, there was a hiring climate that predicated all of it. I was hired at my current organization in 2020, in July 2020. Now, prior to that, there was this thing going on in the 2019 into 2020 called the Great Resignation. And this is where people decided that they wanted to do something about their quality of life. A lot more people wanted to work from home. They wanted to be with their families. They were tired of commuting in every day. Many people quit their careers. They were experiencing burnout and decided, you know what, it's time to move on to something else. We can see that in the data. When we look at February of 2019 to February of 2020, there was a 47% reduction of applications across all industries. Now, some of you may think we also had this thing called the COVID-19 pandemic. Not sure if you heard of it. Actually, when the United States shut down, that was March of 2020. So this is a year prior to any of this even occurring. We're starting to see a significant reduction in the number of applicants and people in the job market because they're looking for something more in that quality of life. So the talent pool itself is electively decreasing. Now, while that's going on, while the talent pool is electively decreasing, we also have big tech going on a hiring spree. And we're also seeing that in the data. Now, first, I want to acknowledge here that this data covers a period from 2019 through 2022. That 2019 to 2020 period is that period of the Great Resignation. And then beyond that is when we get into the COVID-19 years, right? We're all separating, social distancing together, and big tech is actively hiring like crazy. The other piece of data I want to acknowledge here, just because of its bias a little bit, is Amazon. They are part of the supply chain in the COVID-19 pandemic, right? They are part of the improvement of the supply chain. And so they did ramp up significantly in that process. But the rest of big tech, like Microsoft, Apple, Alphabet, they grew by thousands, if not tens of thousands, from 2019 through 2022. This is very frustrating because, again, we have this great resignation going on. People are electively not wanting to work anymore. And also big tech is drinking our milkshake because at the end of the day, the talent pool is only so big. We're all pulling in talent from the same talent pool around the globe. And prior to that, there was this big push for digitization in recruitment as a solution for talent acquisition. So as part of the way that talent acquisition is working, they wanted to move from very manual, toil-based processes into automation so that it can focus on better set of behaviors and better outcomes. So what does that mean? What does the digitization of talent acquisition mean? We really want to automate those data-heavy tasks that are highly repetitive. In the SRE world, this would be analogous to things that we would call toil, right? So we want to automate those processes away. They're also a little error prone. We also want to take things like resume screening, any of the scheduling. So if you've ever done any scheduling where you select your own schedule with talent acquisition or maybe an HR representative or a conference speaker or whatnot, there's scheduling tools that are out there. technology screening, right? To understand, does a person understand a particular technology set, or does the resume actually satisfy a particular technology needs? Chatbots, which are used for relationships, and this is prior to generative AI, when we were working more with natural language processing, just a small segment of what we now use as part of generative AI, and RPAs, or robotic process automation, to manage those leads. Now, all this automation was really there with this promise that it would free up the recruiter's time for more strategic tasks, right? Building out your talent network, as well as building those relationships with the candidates. All right, so let's talk a little bit about a hiring process, right? Because we now understand we've got this great resignation going on, talent pool shrinking. We've got big tech drinking our milkshake. We've got a lot of automation in the process, but what is the process? For most organizations, it looks like this. We have talent acquisition and HR deciding that they're going to have a strategy. They're going to do either open up roles as needed, or there's going to be some sort of recruitment effort to build a talent pool. They might reach out to career fairs or job fairs, right? They really want to build out their network where people can source candidates. It may also include external sourcers as well, whose job is just to collect these networks for you, for these organizations, and set HR up for success in terms of their hirings. Then we may take a candidate through a technical interview, right? Which is like a technical screen. If you're in technology, you've gone through this. This is where you're going to ask them simple questions, and they make it harder and harder over time, but they're really trying to understand what your technical acumen looks like. It's really hard to do in a short period of time. So it tends to be pretty quick though, like 30 minutes to an hour at most, to understand your technical literacy. And then to offset that a little bit, what you can do in practice, more organizations are starting to use automated tests. Now, this is a thing that I had a personal gripe with. The automated testing thing is part of my personal mission, because while they're useful in most contexts, in some contexts, they can be used poorly. And so I had some concerns, so I really wanted to address that. Then there's also a manager meet and greet. And this might not be somebody who's directly invested in the process, maybe a more senior person or a person outside the process. They're really just looking for red flags, right? Because you can have a great candidate and you're like, hey, this person did great on the interview. They did great in the technology screen, but you may have missed the red flags in all of your excitement. So this person's really there to help sell the organization, maybe sell the geography where they're going to need to move to if they need to relocate, sell the culture of the organization, and really look for red flags in the candidate. But if everything's great, then we move on into the next piece, which is the competency-based interview. And we'll cover that shortly, but we really just want to understand not the technology itself that you know, and there's a lot of great questions in competency-based interviews that really help you understand a person and if they're the right team member for the job. Not just do they have the right skill set, but do they have the right behaviors within that skill set to be able to do their job and execute and bring the right kind of values and culture to the organization. And then lastly, we compare the notes, right? We take all of these things and we say, okay, is they skilled enough, right? Do they seem to solve the problems well enough? Do they have no red flags, right? Do they really want to be part of this organization? They match our values. And then do they solve problems in a way that is meaningful to the organization? If everything's great, we give that candidate a thumbs up, we make an offer. And that's typically how most organizations work, at least the organizations that I've worked with as part of the hiring process. So anyway, that's the background about the hiring process we want to work through. So at this point, I need to tell you a little bit of the story, right? So I'm getting a little frustrated with different pieces of the hiring process. And at one point, I was doing a lot of interviews. I think over a course of 3 or 4 years, I was doing hundreds of interviews a year. And I wasn't just doing them for my teams, I was doing them for other teams in the organization. I worked for a large organization. And so I got a reputation for being good at them. I like doing them. I think it's fun. I like picking apart people's brains. And so I was doing an interview. First of all, there's this person on the screen, right? Kind of looks like the Lorax, right? Big bushy mustache. Frowned upon to talk about somebody's physical features, especially as it relates to an interview. But this is important. I was talking to a candidate and I was doing a technical screen. And I think I was asking a simple set of questions, something like, what is SOLID? And SOLID is a acronym. It means like single responsibility, open close principle, Liv-Skoss substitution principle, interface segregation, and dependency inversion. Now, most candidates, they will say something like dependency injection instead of dependency inversion, and we'll navigate that a little bit. So I'm a few minutes into this conversation, and as the conversation's evolving, the facial features aren't really lining up with the mouth at all. Like the movements aren't quite there. Now, I wasn't sure if it was just the audio buffering issues, or if it was like just the latency over the network or whatnot, but it didn't seem right. Something was off. And so I get to this question, right? What's the difference between dependency injection and dependency inversion, right? And really the answer there is dependency injection is a way to perform dependency inversion. It's not the only way, but it is the most common way, typically the way we do things today. So we get to this question and the audio cuts. I'm like, okay, this is not abnormal, right? Sometimes the audio cuts, right? And screens cut, whatever. So the candidate starts typing on the screen, I can't hear you, we're having audio issues. I'm like, okay, it's great. But then something registered in my head. You see, the candidate, as they were typing, I could hear their keyboard clicks in the microphone. So that's when it registered. The person that I was talking to in audio was not the person on the other side of the screen. The person on the other side of the screen was mouthing the words because their microphone was working just fine. Oh my goodness. This is crazy, right? So they said, hey, look, I'm going to call back in a few minutes. I'm going to rejoin the line. Okay, that's fine. And while that's happening, I start texting, IMing the HR department, our recruiter, and saying, hey, what's going on here? I think our candidate might be fraudulent. And they say, stay on the line, start asking questions. And so went ahead and continued the rest of the interview. 5 minutes later, the person shows up again. They're on the visual. Their audio comes through and they ask where we were on their questions. And so we regroup again. And they give me not a great answer, but we continue through the interview. But the voice was completely different. The accent was completely different. The tone was completely different. And the person on the other end was still mouthing the words and things weren't lining up. But they were using their bushy mustache as a cover so that you really couldn't tell that it was necessarily the mouth. But I'm a musician and I could pick up on these audio cues from the way the lips are moving and the way it's supposed to be interacting. And so I knew something was off here. So after everything's said and done, we talked to our recruiters. We really came back and said, hey, we think there might be an issue, particularly with the sourcing agency, and we might need to do something about it. But it was providing some evidence that, hey, there was some fraudulent activity that was going on in the system. Now, if you're in a hiring role, there's some questions. Have you ever experienced fraud in hiring, whether it's the person's audio is different, they won't go on video? I've had situations where people are typing in the questions and I can see them on video typing the questions and they're reading it. It's great that they're resourceful. I think it's important in software engineering, but it's also important you have a good foundations and you're able to express the answers pretty readily. Has the person who showed up on day one not been the person you even interview with? That's another thing that we commonly see. So it's very interesting. So I'm getting frustrated because while we got talent pools are decreasing because of the Great Resignation, right? We got the big tech trying to get everybody they possibly can. We've also got to deal with fraud. This is a really challenging climate to work through, which the reality is with this situation is if you're not cheating, you're not trying. And for a lot of people who are looking for jobs at this time, they are cheating like crazy. All right. So now we got to get into our personal mission a little bit. So I had some concerns about the automated testing that we were using. Some of the questions seemed simple. Some of them are ridiculously hard. And they weren't testing whether you knew the language or not. They were testing, could you solve the puzzle? Which on some level was not great because these are like Mensa level puzzles that you could solve with any language using for loops. And I thought that was really not the right way to solve the problem. Yes, it could screen out certain things, but I'm looking for things like code quality, maintainability, cyclomatic complexity, cognitive complexity, all sorts of things that are important in the maintenance of software over time, not just to solve a problem. And so I had some concerns and I started elevating them to the organization. So in spring of 2022, I started voicing the concern about the automated code assessments. I didn't like the way that they were being used as a blanket utility. I wanted to make sure that we're using them in the right context, maybe with more junior engineers who didn't have a professional background, because it really didn't make sense if you had somebody who wrote clean code to write it in this way. When I took this test, I wrote clean code and I honestly just needed a for loop. But that's just how I write. And that's just, it didn't seem like the right set of problems that we were solving for, because it really wasn't solving for engineering. It was solving for the puzzle. So in summer of 2022, I was asked to be part of a panel that reviewed questions for fit and application. We wanted to improve our questions because we thought that might be a problem. Just again, we didn't want super hard questions, but we wanted them to be enough where you had to understand the sequencing. And so after that, I started to ask has anybody tried to run these through Copilot? Because it was in beta. And ChatGPT, which I think was in an early beta, it was crickets. everybody said that the process was fine. Like, why would we ever be concerned about AI? It was new, and I don't think a lot of people really cared, and it was part of our strategy. So in fall of 2022, ChatGPT 3.5 is released to the general public. And at this point is when I started taking these questions and bringing them through ChatGPT to see which ones could be easily figured out. And as it turns out, a bunch of them, not all of them, could be easily figured out. And that kind of signaled the ones that we needed to start retiring. We need to not use them anymore. But the challenge is when you retire something, you create new work because you now have to create new questions. And those also have to go through the system. And so it's a little bit challenging to deal with. Now, when I started to present some of these findings just about the questions themselves, now this is just technical questions like solving the code puzzle. That's just one lens of this. And I was getting frustrated that I wasn't getting enough attention around it. So in winter of 2022 into January 2023, the plot starts to thicken as I'm spreading this knowledge around. All right. So let's create the context before we get into the thickening of the plot, right? So we got like the Great Resignation. We got big tech drinking our milkshake. We got these fraudulent candidates. We got some automated testing that's really not so great. It's good, but it really could be better. And then we got this challenge of also being on-prem, right? We as an organization, the one I work for, really want people in the locality that we're in. And that's important to us to build up the community that we're operating in. And so these things are just filtering out really good candidates. And it's really becoming problematic to find the right people for the organization. So now it's time for some creative problem solving. Like I'm expressing the frustration, and I happen to be speaking at a conference in the middle of Ohio in the winter, middle of nowhere, right? Snow all around. And we're at this convention, and it's a big technology conference, 4-day conference. And on one end is the conference hall, and the other end is like a resort set of hotel rooms. And in between is a bunch of restaurants. And so I'm walking from the conference center to my bedroom. It's late at night, it's like 10 something at night. And I'm just done. We have an early day the next day. And so one of my buddies who actually is part of this, he was a speaker, and he said, "Hey, Dan, I want to talk to you." And I'm like, "No, buddy, like I'm tired. I'm ready to go to bed." And he's like, "Hey, I'll buy you a drink." I'm like, "Okay, fine. So let's go ahead and have a talk." And so he was talking about my frustrations, and he said, "Look, Dan, I've got a proposition. I think you've done an amazing thing with this test. And I think we need to build some content on this and start talking about this more and help bring better awareness about fraud as a vector, and how generative AI can be a vector in fraudulent candidate hiring, and how we can improve the overall process." And he's a man of science and I'm a man of science. He said, "Look, let's create a process and let's talk about this candidate." And so we started figuring out names for this candidate, and we called him Chet Gupta, which is a play on ChatGPT. And that was the name, Chet. It's like a Texas chat. And so we like that name. And then couldn't figure out a whole name for GPT. So we got Gupta, and we started plotting this out over a napkin at a conference. And we figured we chop this around and figure out, is this worth doing? And as it turns out, this turns out to be a really good set of materials over the long term. A lot of people have had interest in this. I've spoken this particular talk at multiple conferences nationally, and it's been a great talk to bring awareness. But with that, we wanted to find a process that's repeatable so you can bring it to your organization and try it for different human-centered processes, not just talent acquisition, but we wanted to create a persona. Now, when we initially started this, we looked at using LinkedIn and creating a fake profile. It turns out it's frowned upon, so we didn't do that. We did generate some AI bio pictures that we wanted to be a part of that persona as we were pre-gaming before we made that decision to not use LinkedIn. So we're going to go through that in a little bit. We wanted to run the test problems. So I had done a lot of this research. I wanted to run some more problems through ChatGPT as well as Copilot. That was the new hotness at the time, see if it can solve the problems for us. And then I want to prompt some of the technical screen questions. These are the things like your data structures, your algorithms. How do you apply a particular object-oriented pattern versus a functional pattern, whatnot, right? At this point, it's getting late, and we're talking through the process, and we said, hey, look, maybe we want to start bringing talent acquisition along for the ride. Now, as it turns out, somebody from our talent acquisition department was there. And so we were able to pull them in, collude with them a little bit on how we were going to go about this process. And we wanted to have the shock and awe with a larger group, but we really wanted to understand the process a little bit more and bring them to our side of the table, because we didn't want to attack talent acquisition. We just want to make sure that we're addressing a conflict in the process and how to manage that. And then we decided after that we would perform the competency-based interviews questions, which are a little different than our technology questions. They're more situational, they're less technical, and we wanted to see how ChatGPT would respond to that. And then ultimately what we wanted to do is bundle this up together as a nice little package and present it to our talent acquisition department to see if we can make meaningful change in the organization. All right, so these are the Chets. So all of these were generated, I believe, using DALL-E, just like the Lorax picture before. And so the prompt here was using dramatic lighting, create a LinkedIn profile bio picture for a software engineer named Chet Gupta. That was it. Now, when that happened, we got 3 Indian gentlemen who are represented on the screen. And I said, hey, look, at some point during these conferences, I started to realize that Gupta introduced some bias into the system. And so I removed the word Gupta, and then I got these 2 Caucasian gentlemen here as well. Now, if you notice, again, there's still bias in the system because all of the pictures that I generated all assume that software engineers have shallow stubble and glasses, and they picked white people and Indian people based on the names. But as a Hispanic man, right, I could be a Chet too, right? So why not have a Hispanic Chet? Anyway, there's bias in the system. It's there. It's something we need to acknowledge at some point, but this is a system that we're operating in. So we started to select the pictures here. And so if we go from like the top, like in the middle there, we said, hey, this Chet Gupta, he looks like he's a musician, like he plays jazz, music, only drinks IPAs, maybe a little pretentious with him. Maybe he's not the person you want to deal with. So what about the guy on the far right? He looks like he runs, like he's a CEO of a company. So we said, no, maybe we don't want to use him because I'm inspired by him. He doesn't look like an employee. So what about the guy in the bottom left? As it turns out, he looks like a lot of our other engineers as part of our group. And to be too stereotypical there, but he does. And it looks like just like the guy we would hang out with on an everyday basis. Now, these were the 3 candidates we had when we initially started this process. The 2 Caucasian gentlemen were just an afterthought as we were given this. So we're really focused on these 3 people. And so ultimately we selected the guy in the bottom left. He's going to be our Chet. And again, these pictures are all generated. When I first gave this talk, we also had synthesized audio, and now they're synthesized video. So the way that you can present this is interesting because you don't need to have video that's rendered over time. It can be rendered in real time, and that's very interesting. You can have profile pictures that are generated and sent in LinkedIn profiles or even sent in on resumes, right? They aren't the real candidate themselves. Also very interesting. But the guy in the bottom left is the one we chose. Now, the competency-based interview. I want to talk about this one for a second because we talked about the technology screen and technical assessments, but a competency-based interview is one where we're following a star-shaped pattern. So we're looking for things like your situation, your task, your action, and your result. We're not necessarily looking for for what technology you used, although it is important, but how you used it, or maybe how you dealt with a difficult situation, or maybe challenging individuals on teams, or maybe if you're late for a project, but those kind of situations and how you overcame them. We want to make sure you clearly define the problem set in the situation, the task, and the action, and the result. And so the framing is really important because communication is very important when we're hiring people. All right, so we asked Chet, or ChatGPT, when were you on a team that faced challenges? And so the response that we got back was one of the main challenges we faced was communication. We had a feature that involved multiple components and the interactions between them, and it requires close collaboration between the team members to ensure that everyone is on the same page. However, due to different work schedules, time zones, and communication styles, some team members found it challenging to keep up with updates and changes, leading to confusion and misunderstandings. Another challenge we faced was technical. The feature requires integrating with a third-party API that's poorly documented and difficult to use. And some of those team members lacked experience with the API and struggled to understand its nuances, leading to delays and errors. To overcome these challenges, I, Chet Gupta, decided to take several steps. First, I organized daily stand-up meetings to ensure that everyone is aligned on the process and any blockers. Second, I introduced task management tools like Jira or Trello to track progress and maintain transparency. And third, I paired up team members with varying levels of expertise with the API to ensure that everyone has a solid understanding of how it works. And then by taking these steps, we successfully overcame the challenges and helped the team achieve its goal of delivering the new feature by the deadline. Now, some of you are going to have 2 different answers to this, right? Some of you are going to say, this is a great answer. Wow, this is well thought through and it's amazing. And actually, it really is. This is a really great situation, task, action, result of this question, this prompting. The other ones may say, hey, look, this person invented Agile. It's already been invented, which is also true. But believe it or not, we get this a lot. A lot of candidates come in and will say they're not familiar with Agile. They're working in organizations that have only used parts of it or parts of maybe a larger framework. And so they don't have maybe a total experience or a total lens on the things that we're necessarily looking for. And that's okay. And it's okay to have that background just because Agile is supposed to be appropriate for the context that you're in. And so it's okay to not have like maybe a larger understanding of it or maybe a different set of tools. Not everybody uses Jira or Trello. So it's totally okay. So let's ask maybe a technical question, right? Now, technical interviews what we want to understand is the breadth of experience across relevant technologies. So this is how T-shaped you are. And so for a full stack engineer who needs to understand like front end, back end, maybe networking and gateways and whatnot, and databases, this is important. But they're very T-shaped, they're wide in their acumen, but they might not be super deep. But we do want to understand that as well. So we're looking for the depth of any experience in any one technology because we want to really understand how deep or wide they are in a particular area relevant to the role that we're trying to hire for. And then we want to make sure that they're exposed to various patterns and practices. We're going to cover concepts like object-oriented patterns or design patterns. And we really want to figure out what is their total acumen, which is very hard to do in 45 minutes to an hour. And then the way that we do that is through adaptive testing. So we start in an area like maybe like a language like Java or C# in which the questions will get harder and harder, or a design pattern or something like solid single responsibility and whatnot. We'll go through those into harder concepts like into like domain-driven design, general responsibility assignment principles and whatnot. But the goal of that technical interview is to understand against the rubric how this candidate sits, how deep and wide they are, because it's very challenging to do and we have to move quickly. So the adaptive testing model works well for us. So one of the questions we have here is an algorithm. This is actually a retired question, which is in Java, write a function that determines if a given string is balanced. Basically, you want to determine if a string has open parens and close parens, that if you send 8 open parens, do you have 8 close parens? And the ChatGPT response, or the Chet Gupta response, was the one that's posted here, which uses a stack. It's an algorithm, it's a design data structure that allows an object to come in first. And as you add more things, the topmost thing on that stack comes out as opposed to the first item coming out. And so a queue is the opposite of a stack. When that's first in, first out. Stacks are last in, first out. And so this is measuring the open paren. So every time an open paren comes in, it adds something to the stack. And every time a closed paren comes in, it removes something. And if you're at the end, then the stack is empty. Now, is it a perfect answer? Probably not. Is it a good answer? Yeah, it's not bad. It solved the problem. And I think this is pretty fantastic in terms of the response that we're getting. When we look at our rubric answer, the answer is pretty similar, except we're using an integer-based accumulator to do that calculation. So instead of maybe a more memory-intensive object like a stack, we're actually just using an accumulator to say, every time an open paren comes in, we add something, and every time a closed paren comes in, we remove something. And if we're at 0 by the time we're done, instead of negative or positive, then everything's fine. Effectively achieving the same results, right? And so these are good answers or good enough answers, especially if you're dealing with a more junior engineer. So this is starting to look like ChatGPT is not a bad candidate, right? We got our questions that we're asking about competency. We got our algorithm question that's being asked very well. All right, maybe let's ask some slightly harder questions or maybe some data structure questions that are a little different. So one of the things that we wanted to ask for was, could you explain what a concurrent hash map is? And this is a Java-centric data structure for the most part. And a concurrent hash map, as he responds, is a data structure that allows multiple threads to read and write key value pairs simultaneously without inconsistency or race conditions. In a typical hash map, when 2 threads try to access and modify the same key value pair concurrently, a race condition occurs, leading to data inconsistency or even program crashes. However, a concurrent hash map uses a mechanism called locking or synchronization to ensure that multiple threads can access and modify different parts of the hash map at the same time without conflicts. And in a concurrent hash map, the data is divided into buckets. Each bucket has its own lock. And when a thread wants to read or write a key value pair, within that, it first locks the corresponding bucket so that no other thread can access it at the same time. And then once one thread is done, it unlocks the bucket so that another thread can access it. And this mechanism allows multiple threads to access and modify different parts of the hash map concurrently. So it's a great explanation so far. Very worrying. I'm sorry for the wall of text, but that's how it is. What's interesting is what's happening next. So now it starts negotiating trade-offs. So It also responds, however, it is important to note that locking and synchronization mechanisms can introduce some overhead and decrease the performance of the data structure, especially when the number of threads and the size of the hash map is large. Now, when you're dealing with the software engineer, like this is important because like we want to understand, can they look at the design patterns or the way that they're going through the creational process and say, is this the right tool for the job? And so the ability to evaluate a data structure and say it's the right tool for the job is super important. And it's growing more and more important as we look at the kinds of algorithms and structures that we would use for AI, and maybe a B tree for one kind of problem or a KNN algorithm for another, and how we want to manage our grouping and our correlation. So there's a lot of different, just because you know an algorithm doesn't mean that it's the right algorithm for their job. There's a lot of different ways to apply them. So it's important to understand how they sit in context. ChatGPT is providing a contextual-based evaluation of a particular data structure. This is valuable as an engineer. It's valuable for a candidate to understand. As I got into this, there was some things that started to get pretty stinking interesting. So if we look at the results that we're getting, so the one on the right is the organization's kind of rubric response that we're looking for, something along these lines. And the one on the left is the one that ChatGPT gave us. And as I'm starting to evaluate this, I'm looking for common themes. So I've color coded them, like for say, these are the common themes where we have something going on. So in our answer, we segment our internal data structure for locking, where they use the word buckets. And I think it's analogous, right? But what gets interesting is what happens next. So as I started to dive into this, we can see the last piece that we were looking for is that their answer says it locks a corresponding bucket, and in ours, it says it does it without locking at all. So I decided to go ahead and do some research. Which answer is right? I need to know, right? I'm not necessarily a Java guy. I really focus on different languages. So I needed to go do a little research to figure this out. And as it turns out, ChatGPT, Chet Gupta, was more right than we were. This was starting to turn out to be a very interesting thing. Our candidates were better at development and being a better gatekeeper than we were for engineers. So some concerns, and we started to make some changes as a result of that. So we've got this candidate now who's answering questions very well. He's answering situational based questions for teams very well. There was a lot of research about this. A lot of the questions, when they were being asked, it took longer to write the question than it did for ChatGPT to respond to them. And that's crazy, because now it creates these opportunities where a person can read over it, gloss over it, provide some human interjections, maybe some or let me think for a second, and just natural inflection, so it doesn't sound like a robot's reading it. And that's interesting. Now, when we think about prompting, right, at the time we were this writing, a lot of it was based on just text input, but you can also take audio input, do some transcription, live transcription, which drops it into an API and does the same thing as well. So you don't need to have somebody actually handwriting these promptings to give you the results or the feedback that you're looking for. So let's talk through some of these outcomes. All right, so first of all, we presented and bundled all this information. We decided that we really need to have a better awareness about cheating that's occurring during our technical screens and our competency-based interviews. And we wanted to provide some education and uplift to the organization to make sure that they were equipped with the tools necessary to be able to do constructive interviews and root out maybe toxic candidates who weren't going to be valuable for the organization. We also started looking at ongoing scrutiny of the vendors and how things were used. So we had a sourcing vendor as a part of this conversations, particularly the one with the Lorax picture, where that candidate the sourcing agency was actually, we had suspicions that they were providing candidates that weren't the right candidates for the job. Ultimately, we ended up changing our relationship with them because we realized that they were sending us candidates that were fraudulent. And so it closed a gap there. That was a significant vector. And then we also looked at our testing tool to say, is this the right tool? And so one of the interesting parts about the testing tool was that I started asking questions about the test. I said, hey, look, I don't think these answers are the right answers. And they said, everything's fine. The people who write the test say everything's fine. It's not going to be an issue. And so I said, okay, that's great. I'm not really sure it's a good enough answer. Who writes the test? I said, the vendor does. So screaming in font ligatures at this point, right? And I said, okay, so the people we pay to do their job are telling us there's nothing to see here. There's nothing to worry about. Oh, snap, we need to do something about this. So we met with the vendor, we started talking through the tool, and we said, hey, look, what do you guys think about generative AI? How are you guys navigating? And They were letting us know that they love it and they think it's great. It's a powerful tool, and it's hard to test for because it's non-deterministic, which basically means that it's not going to give you the same answer every time. And the facts play into the facts, so it can give you new answers based on previous facts. And that's all very interesting, except we pay for a tool that can now be broken with generative AI. This is a problem. So are we going to continue to pay for this tool? So I said, what do you guys think we should do with your tool if it's not satisfying the problems for the use cases that we have today? And they said, look, don't use it as a complete stopgap. Why don't you go ahead and proctor your tests? Now, I told you we're interviewing a lot of people, right? So I can't take my best engineers all day and take them away from valuable work they're contributing to the organization to sit down and make sure if somebody's actually taking a test correctly. So it becomes a big problem in terms of how we use our best people to solve for problems for the organization. So really take an extra scrutiny to say, is this the right tool for the job? And how are we going to approach this tool? And so we had to look at changes to our technical testing, and we're still in evaluation for using things like public facing repositories. And we're leaving certain things up to the hiring managers to say, hey, if this test isn't appropriate for you, we might not introduce this tested result as a way to bias against a particular candidate. Maybe you want to use a different mechanic or vehicle to make that happen. And the reality is our tools, they're just not good enough, right? So tools in isolation, such as our automated code testing tool, it's an ineffective stopgap. But on that aside, there's also other challenges, right? Our adaptive testing is no longer an effective litmus because you're just one prompt away from being able to get a well-reasoned answer. And this is going to start to require more social interaction to improve the feedback loop. So we can start getting better cues about whether a person is a bot or whether they're actually a different person in the audio, or there's someone who's manipulating in some way, right, to get hired for whatever reason, right? So some things like, after giving this conference a few times, I've heard certain different talent acquisition folks say, I've seen this is crazy. And so what I've started doing is using instructions on a Post-it note and having the candidate read the instruction on the Post-it note and provide the same response, or just give a response to the note, or provide a visual cue on the Post-it note, or maybe some sort of like notepad to say, I want you to do this. And then maybe look to the left or to the right, just to see if they were the person who was actually seeing the content on the screen. And so that was very valuable feedback. And I think we've started to consider what it means to have better social interaction, is cameras on and visual cues and whatnot in our feedback loop. But the tools themselves in isolation are not good enough. And so we're going to have to get more creative about the way we validate the legitimacy of a candidate. We have to consider that competency-based interviews at this point too as well, they can be framed with some light prompting. It doesn't take much for a candidate to derive context or create some context behind the scenes. And as we were creating these competency-based questions, I think we went through for the CBI probably 7 to 10 questions, and each one was pretty stinking good, to be honest with you. And very long-winded responses, which is CBI typically only has, it's an hour-long conversation, typically only has 3 to 4 questions. You want them to be long essay kind of questions. And so you're getting a lot of rich, deep context with light prompting. And that's really challenging to navigate. And quite frankly, as we've seen, the automated code test can be easily solved with plenty of lead time to introduce those human elements, making mistakes or doing things that kind of look close enough. These code tests typically will run, and they'll run with a bunch of unit tests. And you'll find that some of these tests, maybe 99% test coverage, because they introduce a human element by design, because they had the time that would allow them to be able to look human. They're not perfect solutions or close enough solutions. And that's very interesting. And the text screens, again, are just a prompt away from providing well-reasoned examples. So what it would look like if you wanted to try this, I think the first thing you need to do is assume positive intent. Hiring talent is not a frictionless process. There's plenty of opportunities to reduce the friction, but some of that friction is important. But just because it can be automated doesn't mean it should be automated. And that's something we need to figure out as we navigate a Gen AI world. I once heard that generative AI or AI in general should be the best thing that happens for humans, not the worst thing that happens to humans. And so I think it's important to just be pragmatic and appropriate when we apply automation and artificial intelligence to our process. I think the next thing to do is to lead with empathy. It could take months or years to bring in tools that will help reduce this friction or things like toil. And in our case, it took a very long time to bring this automated testing tool, which at the crest of its mature implementation became highly exploitable using generative AI. And lastly, Thirdly, you want to be able to bring talent acquisition with you. It's better to work together to address concerns than to attack a process or a people group who created that process, such as a department. You really want to bring them along for the ride and say, hey, look, I think we might have an exploit vector. I want to suss this out with you. Can you help me, understand where your context is? And I'm going to show you where my research is. And we're going to work together to create a better process. And lastly, seek win outcomes. Ultimately, you're looking for an effective process. The person that you're going to hire, especially if you're dealing with the talent acquisition process, the person you're going to hire is going to spend about 1,800 hours a year with you. That's the average amount of time a U.S. candidate will spend in office or working with somebody, hybrid, remote, whatever, with your peers. And so if you're building a team, you want to make sure you protect your team. That's a lot of time that they're going to spend with them. You want to make sure that they're the right candidate for the job. So if you do have any questions, you want to look at some of the research that we've done, I would feel free to reach out to me. You can reach out to me by email at danielmpries@gmail.com, or you can reach out to me on LinkedIn at in/DanielMPries. Thank you for taking the time today to sit through this conversation and learn some more, and hopefully you had a great time. Thank you again and have a great day.